Hello, this is Snuggle in Storytime. I am reading out loud the last of the Really Great Whangdoodles. It is written by Julie Andrews Edwards, and I have permission through HarperCollins Publishers to read this out loud. This is episode 7. We will have 2 more episodes after this one. I do want to give you a heads up that these will be lengthy, so about an hour in length for each episode. So if you want to choose to break it into 2 segments, you may do so at about the 30 mark, or you can sit and listen to the whole thing. So enjoy. This is episode 7. Do you remember what happened last time? This high-behind splinter cat visited Lindy in her bedroom, and she decided to go to Wangdoodle land all on her own. What do you think the professor's going to think? What do you think Tom and Ben are going to think waking up in the morning and not having their sister there? All right, we're going to dive into chapter 6 and find out. The next morning, Ben woke early and ambled into Tom's room, and he found his brother sitting on the side of his bed looking somewhat groggy. "Did I just wake you up?" asked Ben. "Yeah, I had a terrible night. I just couldn't sleep." "Neither could I. I guess we were just excited about today and being with the professor. Let's go see if Lindy's awake." And they went to Lindy's room and cautiously opened the door. Her bed was empty, and the covers were in all disarray. "I guess she couldn't sleep either," yawned Tom. Ben walked over to the closet and picked up Lindy's pajamas off the floor. His eyes scanned the rack of clothes. "Do you know where her blue pants are? Neither is her cloak. They aren't here, and her shoes are gone." "What'd she get dressed for?" said Tom as he scratched his head. "She never dresses until after breakfast." After a thorough search of the house, the boys were more puzzled than ever, and Ben said, "I've got a feeling something's wrong." "Well, maybe she went over to the professor's house," said Tom. "At 7 in the morning?" The boys looked at each other, and suddenly Ben said, "I think we should give him a call." "Well, what if we wake him up?" "Well, then it means that Lindy isn't with him, or she hasn't reached him. Either way, we ought to check." As Ben dialed the number, Tom said, "Boy, if she's there, man, this is just a stupid thing to do." The professor's voice came over the phone, and Ben spoke hurriedly. Hello, Professor, this is Ben. I'm sorry to bother you, and I hope I didn't wake you. Have you seen Lindy? Is she with you? We can't find her, and we thought that—"
"I know, Ben. I know. I was just about to phone you."
Ben detected an anxious quality in the professor's voice.
"Lindy isn't with me, but I know where she is. Don't ask any questions. I'll explain when you get here. It's imperative that you come over right away."
"What about Ethel? What should I tell her?"
"Well, say that I've invited you over for an early breakfast, but be careful and get out of that house before she realizes Lindy isn't with you. Don't panic now, but hurry."
A half hour later, the boys jumped off their bicycles and ran up the steps to the professor's front door. He was waiting for them, his face pale and angry-looking.
"You got here quickly. Come with me."
"Where's Lindy?" Ben asked.
"She's in Wangdoodle land." "What? You're kidding me." "I'm afraid I'm not kidding. That miserable Proc, that cunning, devious demon. Apparently, late last night, Lindy received a visitor from a creature called a high-behind splinter cat, a devastating animal, seductive and smooth-talking as you please. She must have seen a sympathetic cat with her."
"She did," interrupted Tom. "She showed it to us last night."
"Yes, well, I only discovered that it was missing this morning. She must have forgotten to give it to me, or maybe the Proc stole it."
"How do you know all this?" said Ben.
"I had a visit from the Proc just before you telephoned. That smug, cunning creature was so pleased with himself he could cheerfully have punched him in the nose. The thing that makes me angriest of all is that if I'd had 1 ounce of sense yesterday, I'd have realized what the Proc was up to."
"What do you mean?" Tom said, puzzled.
"Well, the whole journey on the jolly boat, the wonderful afternoon, and the fun that we had was all designed to lull us into some false sense of security. Lindy had such a good time that she completely forgot her fears, and by the time the Splinter Cat finished his charming act, Lindy was more than willing to go with him. Now, I understand what the Wiffle Bird was trying to tell us. We were being taken for a ride, and I was just too stupid to see it. And it was all a part of that Proc's evil plan."
Ben was furious. "You know, kidnapping is a crime." "What are they going to do with Lindy?" Tom asked with concern. "She must be really scared."
"I don't think so," said the professor. "The Proc informed me that she is happy and will be well taken care of. He will release her when I promise on my honor to give up trying to reach Wangdoodle Land, and the Wangdoodle for that matter. I have until tomorrow morning to give him my decision, but of course I'll agree to his terms."
"You mean we have to give up the whole adventure?" Ben said with a horrified voice.
"I'm afraid so."
"But why?" cried Tom. "Why not just call the Proc's bluff? I'm sure he wouldn't do anything to hurt Lindy. You said yourself that all the creatures in Wangdoodle Land are peaceful loving."
"Yes, Tom, it is true, but I sense that the Proc is getting desperate. Remember, he feels that Wangdoodle Land is in great danger. With so much at stake, he might not harm Lindy, but he could keep her there indefinitely."
"But there must be something we can do," said Tom desperately. "It just turns me inside out to think what the Proc has want, and we'll never get to see the Wangdoodle." "Wait a minute." Ben looked up suddenly. "You don't have to give the Proc an answer before tomorrow, right, Professor?"
"Well, that's right."
"Then why don't we just go and try to rescue Lindy now, while we've still got time?" "What a great idea!" Tom said excitedly. "We could sneak in and get her out of Wangdoodle Land before the Proc knew anything about it. He'd never expect us to do something like that."
"But hold on, I'm not sure. That's wise. The Proc could capture us too. Then what would we do?"
"Well, it'd be a risk, but we could be extra careful. I bet the Wiffle Bird could help us." "Oh, come on, Professor, say that we can do it," urged Tom. "This is the only chance that we have to put things right. Then we could still try to see the Wangdoodle if we wanted to."
"Well, I must say I do hate to give up the experience." The professor wavered.
"We can't give up. After all of our hard work, you know Wangdoodle Land better than anyone. You could take us to find Lindy. I know you could. Please say yes." The professor walked into the French windows and gazed across the lawn, and after what seemed like an eternity, he quietly said,
"Very well, we will try it. Perhaps we will be lucky and find Lindy before anyone finds us." He turned to the boys. "I shall phone your house and speak to Ethel, and I will tell her that we've plans for an excursion."
And Tom said, "Well, she won't mind that. Mom told her that we'd be spending a lot of time with you."
"Oh, good. But on second thought, it might be better to tell her that we'll be gone for a few days. That way, if something unexpected happens and we're delayed, she won't worry."
"If she thinks we'll be gone a few days, she'll expect us to take some clean clothes," Ben pointed out.
"Oh, that's using your head, Ben. Well, you better go back home and pick up some things. Get something for Lindy, too. I'll have Mrs. Primrose prepare us a good hot breakfast before we leave. It could be the last meal that we'll have for a while. Now, let's hurry. Wangdoodle Land is a large country, and we don't know where Lindy is, and we haven't a moment to lose."
Lindy was beginning to feel anxious. It seemed as if she had been walking for hours.
"Oh, dear friend, are you getting weary?" the Splinter Cat asked. "Would you like a ride?"
Before Lindy could answer, the cat's tail encircled her waist and lifted her high into the air and deposited her gently on his back.
"There. Now isn't that nice? Much more fun, too."
Lindy had to admit that sitting on the Splinter Cat's back was much better than walking, even though she had a tendency to slide forward, since the cat's behind was so much higher than his front. But she had soon made herself comfortable by hooking one arm around the cat's tail and tucking one leg under herself. The brilliant sun came up over the horizon, bathing everything in a soft pink glow. The spring-like air carried tantalizing aromas of popcorn and cinnamon toast that wafted past Lindy's nose, reminding her that she was rather hungry. She knew instinctively the smells were coming from the unusual shrubs and bushes so abundant in the area. She made a mental note to tell the professor about it when she saw them. They came to the bottom of a high mountain.
"Hold on tight now," said the Splinter Cat,
as he began to climb sure-footedly, and he moved up the almost vertical face of this rock.
"This is where my long back legs become very useful," he said. "They're making me go up mountains so easy."
Lindy shuddered to think of what would happen if she fell off the Splinter Cat's back, so she took a firm grip on his tail and told herself not to be afraid. They reached a wide plateau. There were boulders and rocks lying as if a giant hand had scattered them about the landscape. There were trees, too, short scrubby ones that were shiny, black like patent leather, and large ones with generous branches and bright melon-yellow leaves in clusters.
"Now, are you ready for a surprise?"
said the Splinter Cat, lowering Lindy gently to the ground. She followed the cat into a small grove where he pointed and said proudly,
"This is it, home sweet home."
Lindy saw a big lollipop-shaped structure, which looked as if it were made of something soft and furry, and at a second glance she saw that it was a tree, which was completely covered with colored yarn, laced and interlaced in such a way that the structure was strong and durable.
"Come and see inside,"
purred the Splinter Cat. He sprang across the clearing and leapt into the tree, disappearing from view.
"Don't leave me, please, please don't leave me," cried Lindy.
Just a minute, just a minute."
And the cat's head appeared through the skeins of wool and grinned at her. Then he withdrew and reappeared high up, eyes shining mischievously.
"I'm sending down some stairs,"
and a rope ladder tumbled out of the tree, and it swung invitingly beside her.
"Come on up, Lindy,"
called the cat. Lindy placed a foot carefully on the first rung and climbed until she found herself in an amazing and ingeniously built room. It was like the inside of a cocoon. The floor, walls, and ceiling were a continuous curve of geometrically woven yarn in rainbow colors. Yellow leaves in the tree pushed through the weaving, and the room looked as if it were sprigged with flowers. The bottom of the cocoon was low slung like a hammock, and it held a large, luxurious pillow. It was easily as big as the bed, and it was made of silk and satin patchwork squares, and it had a beautiful orange tassel on each corner.
"Come and sit by me."
The Splinter Cat padded into the middle of the bed and settled down.
It's good to be home."
He held out a large box of delicious-looking candies. "Have some wodge." Lindy was very hungry. She gratefully took one of the candies, and it tasted like marzipan and honey and sweet caraway seeds. "What is this?" "Oh, they're terrific," she said, taking another. "Oh, they are the Wangdoodle's favorite food," grinned the Splinter Cat. "He has a very sweet tooth, you know." Lindy ate 6 more pieces of candy and felt a lot better. "Well, how do you like my place?" The cat gazed at her, and his tail brushed softly across her forehead. She blinked sleepily. Her eyelids felt heavy.
"Oh, I think," she yawned, "that it's the loveliest and the most beautiful place that I've ever seen."
A great drowsiness overcame her. She lay back and gazed up at the dome ceiling, where patches of persimmon-colored sky showed through the latticework of wool. The sun shone onto the yellow leaves, and they caught the light and sent reflections dancing around the room. A breeze stirred the tree, and Lindy felt herself being rocked, and she slipped down and down into the warmth and the luxury of a welcome sleep. Chapter 7. The professor and the boys were standing in the middle of the Blandlands plain. The waving sea of brightly colored flowers stretched ahead for miles and miles. In the distance, the Wangdoodles' place sparkled in the early morning sunlight. The professor leaned on his umbrella and said,
"Now, this is the way I see it. The Proc and the high-behind Splinter Cat took Lindy away, and what would he do with her? Where would he take her for safety? He wouldn't take her to the palace, because the whole point is to keep us away from the palace. So my hunch is that Lindy is with the Splinter Cat."
"But how do we find the Splinter Cat?" said Ben.
"I only know that he lives in the mountains, but it could be those mountains, or those mountains, or—"
and he pointed both north, east, and west. Ben's heart sank.
"Oh, gosh, she could be anywhere. It's going to take ages to find her."
"Perhaps not. Let's use our heads and work this out. The Splinter Cat is probably just like any other mountain cat. He would need a rocky terrain with trees, perhaps a cave or two. These mountains to the west have a forest, but it looks a bit dense, so it's too dark and too gloomy for a Splinter Cat."
"Well, those mountains are open and grassy," as Ben pointed north.
"Right. So I'll bet that the Splinter Cat's lair is in the east, somewhere beyond Ploy. Probably in the Gambit region. That's perfect cat territory. Come on, boys. We've got a long way to go."
They walked for what seemed like hours. They grew hot and thirsty, and it was a relief to hear the soft singing sound that told them that they were near the stretch of the Golden River. The boys ran to it and drank their fill of the cool, refreshing water.
"Can you two swim?" the professor asked suddenly. "It occurs to me that it would reach the mountains much faster if we crossed this river."
"Well, let's do it," said Ben enthusiastically. So they took their clothes and rolled them into their shoes in tight bundles, and they waded into the water and swam slowly across the side, holding the bundles above their heads. It was a fascinating swim. At every stroke, the water changed its tune, making sweet music as they swam. Once on the other side, they dressed hurriedly. Tom looked around.
"You know, it's odd that the wiffle bird hasn't shown up yet."
"It's odd, I do agree. Of course, she may be watching out for Lindy."
"She may not know where she's at," suggested Ben.
I actually miss her company," declared Tom, "even though she's a nuisance sometimes. It's nice really having her around."
Ben noticed a movement off to his left. He pointed and whispered, "I thought I saw something." They crouched on the ground and remained absolutely still. A group of fierce-looking creatures emerged from the break in the rocks and moved slowly in a line towards the Golden River. There were at least 6 or 7 of them, about 6 feet high at the shoulders, with shaggy, caramel-colored fur and enormous, curling, sharp-pointed horns. "What are they?" gasped Tom.
"That's a herd of flummox."
The professor's face was alight with excitement.
"They're distant relatives of the great aurochs that roamed Earth and in Europe thousands of years ago. We'd better give them a wide berth. They could be dangerous."
When they finally reached the foot of the mountains, they were travel-stained and weary. Tom trailed a few paces behind the others, noticing something small and shiny lying against the stone. "Professor!" he said excitingly.
"Hush, Tom!
"No, look what I found!" The professor examined the shiny object.
Why, that's a 25-cent piece."
It's the one I gave Lindy. I know it is. She said that she would keep it in her pocket as a lucky piece, so she must have dropped it. Don't you see?"
"Well, that proves that we are on the right track. Oh, what a stroke of luck!"
"Professor, look at this!" cried Ben, and he knelt down to look closely on the ground. "It's a paw print, a really large paw print."
"Oh, it's the Splinter Cat's all right," confirmed the professor. "See that plateau? I'll bet you anything that's where he went."
"But how do we get up there?"
"Oh, there's got to be some way. Come on."
At that moment, a great shriek rent the air. It was so loud and so close that the professor and the boys practically jumped out of their skins. Terrified, they flung themselves to the ground. "What do you suppose that is?"
"Well, whatever it is, it's pretty big. Oh, let's be careful."
They crawled forward. A faint mist hung just above the heads, and there was a damp feeling in the air. They became aware of a heavy panting sound, and cautiously they peered around a high wall of rock, and there, standing at the foot of the mountain, enveloped in clouds of steam, was the most remarkable train they had ever seen. It was pure white, and gave the impression of being made from thick, fluffy cotton wool. Yet the rods and the wheels and the couplings and the great engine itself looked strong and shone like polished steel. Written on the side, in bold letters, were the words, "The Brain Strain." The professor was staggered.
"I expected wonders in this incredible land, but I never thought I'd see anything as wonderful as that."
And he looked at the mountain. Silver rails went straight up the sheer rock face and disappeared into the clouds.
"If I'm not mistaken, that train goes directly to the top. That, my friends, is how we're going to reach Lindy and the Splinter Cat."
"But what makes that train go? I don't see any engineer, do you?"
The professor scrutinized the train intently, and he mumbled to himself,
"Steam, hot air, brain strain.
And his face suddenly brightened.
Oh, I got it! That thing is full of hot air. Hot air rises. That's how it goes up the mountain. That's why it doesn't need an engineer."
"How does it get down the mountain again?" asked Tom.
"Well, I have absolutely no idea, but come on. We've got to board that train."
They started around the wall, but the professor suddenly grabbed the boys and pulled them back.
"Oh, wait! Look out!" he whispered tensely. "Sidewinders."
3 of the horrifying creatures were emerging from the trees. They were in deep conversation. Their trunks waved in the air, and their feet crunched the gravel path as they made for the train. The brain strain gave another shriek and began to puff and blow mightily. Clouds of steam belched out of the engine and rolled towards the professor and the boys. "Come on, let's go, urged the professor as they began to run. Under the protective cover of billowing steam, the boys made a dash for it. The train was beginning to move. Ben was the fastest, and he was the first to gain a foothold on the steps of the moving caboose. He turned in time to see the professor reach out and hook his umbrella onto the railing to pull himself aboard. Tom was in the rear, and to everyone's horror, he suddenly stumbled and fell. The train was gathering speed, and the boy's face took on a look of panic, and he saw it pulling away from him. "Come on, Tom, come on!" Tom scrambled to his feet and ran as hard as he had ever in his entire life. His legs began to ache, and a desperate sob caught his throat. The professor leaned out as far as he could, and he handed one end of his umbrella to Tom. The boy grasped it tightly, and the professor yanked hard, and Tom, stumbling and lurching, was hauled aboard the train, where he lay panting and gasping with relief. The professor pulled him to his feet. "Hold on, Tom, we're climbing very, very fast." The boy gripped the railings and gave the professor a weak grin of thanks. The brain strain heaved and puffed its way up the face of the mountain. Higher and higher it climbed. They were nearing the plateau. Over the noise of the engine, the professor shouted, "It isn't going to stop! We'll have to jump!" Suddenly the train leveled off and began to gather speed at an alarming rate. "No!" yelled the professor, and the three of them leapt from the speeding train. They hit the earth hard, rolling over and over, tumbling and bouncing. Tom was flung into a bush, and the professor disappeared. Ben staggered to his feet, weaving unsteadily towards his brother. "Are you okay?" "Yeah. Where's the professor?" "Oh, here," came a faint reply. "Over the edge." They rushed to the precipice. The professor's umbrella had caught on a root, and he was hanging on to it for dear life and swaying gently out over the void. The boys leaned over and grabbed him. Ben clasped his wrist, and Tom caught hold of his collar, and with a mighty heave they pulled him to safety. He was deathly white, and lay for several moments face down in the grass. Presently he rolled over and gazed up at the sky, and then he looked at the boys. Oh, thank you both," he said simply. "That was a close call." He sat up and looked at the mountain where, high above, the brain strain came to a halt. The sidewinders got out. Then a remarkable thing happened. The train slowly vanished before their eyes. "Good Lord!" The professor shook his head in disbelief. "Well, that answers your question, Tom. The brain strain doesn't have to get down from the mountain. It dissipates at the top."
"How could it do that?" said Ben.
"Well, like any hot air that rises, it just dissipates. That accounts for all the clouds up here. I presume the train resembles itself at the bottom of the mountain, and when it has gathered enough hot air, it moves up once again. It's fantastic."
Tom and Ben helped him to his feet. They could see that the adventure had been quite a strain for their friend. He looked pale and not very steady, but he gazed around with interest and said brightly,
"Well, I wonder where we go from here."
We're going to start chapter 8, but if you want to stop now listening, you can always tune in and continue for where I'm going to start now. Chapter 8. When Lindy woke up, she found the Splinter Cat sitting beside her, washing himself.
"Oh, goodness. Did I sleep very long?"
"Oh, not too long," replied the cat, licking his paw.
"How do you feel, Miss Lindy?" I feel fine, but I think I ought to be getting home. My brothers might have found out that I'm gone, and I know they're going to be worried.
And the cat sprang up. Oh, but Miss Lindy, I have a tremendous favor to ask you. I wonder if you would help me with this. And he produced a large ball of wool. Every friend that comes to visit me in my cat's cradle with me, I add it to my house. It's like signing my guest book.
Lindy frowned. All right, but please, let's hurry.
She was beginning to feel a little annoyed.
What do I have to do?
Now, Miss Lindy, use the finger and thumb of each hand and pick up the wool in the middle. Lindy did as she was told, and the cat transferred the thread to her hands. Perfect, breathed the splinter cat. He lifted a paw to take up the wool again, and somehow the threads slipped, and Lindy found her hands bound by the brightly colored strands. Oh dear! The cat blinked in alarm. It slipped out of my grasp. Hold on, dear friend. Let me unwind it. He turned to Lindy. I think the wool goes under here and through here. Lindy began to feel dizzy, for the cat passed the ball of wool under her arms and around her waist, and then over her hand so quickly that she hadn't time to follow his movements. The results were disastrous, for by the time the cat had finished, she was so tangled up in wool that she couldn't even move.
What have you done? She said in an angry voice. I told you I want to go home. It's terribly late, and you promised that we would be back in an hour.
Well, how goes it? Said a familiar voice, and Lindy felt a chill run up her spine. The Proc's tall frame filled the doorway. The splinter cat cast a quick look towards Lindy. Good heavens, Splinter Cat, what have you been up to? The Proc began to laugh, and the cat chuckled, and Lindy had seen and heard enough to know that she was in terrible trouble. She glared at the Proc. I know what you're up to, she said, trying desperately not to cry. You just stop all of this and let me go home. The professor's going to be furious with you when he finds out. Oh, he already knows, my dear, the Proc replied casually. And I've told him that if he wants you back, then he must stop trying to reach the Wangdoodle. And if he agrees, you may go home at once.
What if he doesn't agree?
Well, that's a problem we'll just have to face when the time comes. And he turned to the Splinter Cat. Keep her here. I'll be in touch. I've got to go to push on to the palace. Is the Wangdoodle very upset? The Splinter Cat asked. He's beside himself, replied the Proc. He believes this is all my fault, and he's keeping me twice as busy just because he's cross. The cat shook his head sympathetically. Oh, don't worry, Proc. It'll be over soon. Yes, thank goodness. And the Proc raised a hand in farewell. Goodbye, Miss Lindy. I apologize for the inconvenience, but I have no alternative. Lindy turned her head away and didn't answer. When she looked back again, the Proc was gone. The Splinter Cat stretched and yawned. Oh my, it's going to be a long day. How about some watch, Miss Lindy?
Don't talk to me, she snapped back. You're a false friend. If I had my way, you'd lose all the rest of your 8 lives right now.
The Splinter Cat winced, but he simply said, just as you please. And he stretched back on the pillow and idly stroked the geometric pieces of wool above his head. Rippling notes of the music came from the taut strings, and Lindy watched with surprise as the Splinter Cat played on the walls of his house as though it were a harp. Her thoughts turned to the professor and Thomas and Benjamin. She knew how worried they must be. What would the professor do in a situation like this? Would he give in to the proc? Or would he try to rescue her? Oh, Lindy thought that the boys would encourage such a move. But if they did try to find her, how would they know where she was? Suddenly she had an idea. It wasn't a very good one, but it was the best that she could come up with. She began to sing a song to the Splinter Cat's music. The creature looked startled, but he smiled happily, and to Lindy's great relief continued to play. Ben, Tom, and the professor had been searching for hours, but there was still no sign of Lindy, and suddenly Tom noticed something on the horizon. He studied it for a moment, and then he shouted, "Professor, look! It's the wiffle bird!" They watched as the wiffle bird flew straight to them and settled on Tom's shoulder, and he patted the beautiful feathers and said, "I knew you'd turn up sooner or later. We're in a terrible fix, wiffle bird. We can't find Lindy, and we simply must reach her somehow." The bird made sympathetic noises and preened herself. At that moment, an eerie sound echoed across the plateau. It was a dreadful noise, mourning and lonely, a wailing, sobbing cry that moved up and down the scale and went echoing around the mountains. "What on earth is that?" Ben spoke in a hushed voice. The professor held up a hand. "Listen, there it goes again." Tom frowned, and then he said intently, "I may be imagining things, but I think I hear something else. Another sound underneath it. Do you know what I mean, Professor?"
Are you sure, Tom?
Yes. Do you know what it is? It's Lindy. I can hear Lindy singing.
Where, Tom? Where's it coming from?
The boy strained to pick out the tiny, fragile sound from amongst the shifting echoes. Then, for a moment, the wailing stopped, and in the silence Lindy's voice came through clearly. "It's that way!" Tom yelled, pointing. "That's where she is!" No one was prepared for what happened next. The wiffle bird suddenly shot up in the air. "Mayday!" she shrieked, and then again, "Mayday!" The professor looked up and saw a huge shadow coming towards them.
"Oh, look out!" he cried.
Grabbing both boys, he shoved them to safety under the nearest tree, and seconds later, a whirling wind, like a hurricane, flattened them all to the ground. "What is that? What is that?" gasped Ben in a panic.
"It's the gigantus!" coughed the professor in the dust that swirled around them.
The huge shadow passed overhead again, and the boys caught a glimpse of the colossal wing with large ragged feathers. Black talons scraped the earth as the monster above them banked to avoid the tree, and the swirling air engulfed them again. "Where's the wiffle bird?" Tom looked over anxiously. She squawked indignantly from the branches above his head. The professor and the boys waited for 5 full minutes before coming out from under that tree, and to their relief, the giant bird was nowhere in sight.
"Oh, good Lord, that was close. We were very lucky indeed."
"Do you think the gigantus saw us?"
"I doubt it. It would surely have attacked us, for it is a dumb creature that acts first and thinks later. You know, had it wanted to, it could have easily had picked up that whole tree."
Tom said,
"Well, I sure hope we don't run into it again. Well, I think we're safe now. Let's hurry and get Lindy and ourselves out of this mess."
He set off in a westerly direction, the boys falling into step beside him. The wiffle bird shook herself and then flew ahead as if leading the way. The Splinter Cat had been howling ever since Lindy completed her song. In the beginning, he had played music to accompany for her, overjoyed at the sweet music they were making together. But as the song progressed and Lindy's clear voice sang the melody to perfection, the cat's amber eyes were filled with tears. He continued to play, and every once in a while would draw his paw across his face and sigh deeply. And when the song was over, he said with feeling, "Oh, Miss Lindy, you're singing so sweetly."
Thank you. It's because you play so well,
replied Lindy. Seeing that the cat was flattered, she added,
"Let's do some more. This is so much fun."
The cat took up the accompaniment once again, and Lindy put all the expression she could into her voice. The splinter cat began to blink furiously, and suddenly he could control his feelings no longer. He rolled back his head and howled, and Lindy quickly realized that the howling was much louder than her voice and would carry twice as far. If the professor and the boys were anywhere in the vicinity, they would certainly hear it. She continued to sing, "Oh, Miss Lindy," the cat bawled. "Stop! I can't stand it. It's so pretty." His back leg drummed the floor in ecstasy, and his fluffy tail waved rhythmically back and forth.
"Please play something else," coaxed Lindsay. "I'm having such a good time."
The splinter cat huffed and wiped his nose, and he began to strum another melody. But when Lindy joined in, the strain became too great, and he broke down completely. "Stop! Oh, stop, 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 stop!" he sobbed, and rolled on the floor, covering his head with his paw. Lindy took a deep breath and wondered how much longer she could keep up with this. She almost choked with surprise as the professor's head came into view over the threshold. He cautiously peered into the room, saw her, and put a finger to his lips, and then ducked out of sight. The professor ran back to the bushes where the boys were hiding. "She is in there. She's all right. Oh, but now, the question is, how are we going to get her out of there?" He had no sooner uttered those words that the wiffle bird, who had been sitting quietly in the nearby tree, flew to the ground, landed a foot or so from the splinter cat's domain, and she squawked horribly and lay very still. "What's the matter with her?" Tom asked anxiously. "Hush!" said the professor silently. The howling of the splinter cat had stopped, and in silence the wiffle bird squawked again, as if in great pain. The splinter cat's startled head popped through the strands of wool, his amber eyes red with emotion and tears. The cat looked around quickly and saw the apparently helpless wiffle bird lying on the ground. His ears pricked up, his eyes opened wide, and then became gleaming, calculating slits, and he disappeared. "Professor," whispered Tom, "we've got to do something. The wiffle bird's in trouble." Wait, Tom, just wait." The professor laid a restraining hand on Tom's arm. The splinter cat came out of his house, his belly pressed flat to the tree. The wiffle bird fluttered in panic and rolled a few feet away. She began to emit a series of agonizing squeaks and gasps. The splinter cat eased his way down the tree, ears flattened, a quick grin on his face, and then he pulled himself forward, one paw at a time, until within a few feet of the wiffle bird. Ben held his breath. Tom, horror-stricken, tugged at the professor's sleeve, but the professor again signaled for the boys to wait. The splinter cat's body tensed, and his high behind began to move from side to side. And with a mighty leap he sprang for the wiffle bird, and she rocketed into the air, evading the grasping claws by mere inches. Beautiful feathers flew in all directions, and she landed a little way from the cat and dragged herself along the ground. The cat looked surprised and pounced again, and once more the wiffle bird took to the air, and she flapped around and around in low circles, and the cat's head twisted wildly, and his neck was a veritable corkscrew. The professor took a small penknife out of his pocket.
"I'm going to get Lindy. You wait for me here, and you do not move. Do you understand?"
The boys nodded. The splinter cat had been lured a considerable distance from the tree, and the professor waited until the cat had his back to him, and then quickly and silently he ran to the ladder and climbed up. Lindy was overwhelmed with relief when she saw him. The professor cut her loose.
"Stay close to me, and when I tell you, I want you to run as fast as you can."
As the professor and Lindy climbed down the ladder, they glimpsed the splinter cat thrashing wildly in the air, and at the wiffle bird spinning and rolling and tumbling in all directions. And while the cat struggled to recover both balance and senses, Lindy and the professor ran to the bushes where the boys were hiding. The children embraced themselves silently.
"Now what do we do?" whispered Ben. "We wait to see if the wiffle bird is going to be all right, and then we get out of here."
By some miracle, the wiffle bird had evaded all attempts of capture. The cat, obsessed with the desire to catch this annoying and elusive creature, made a last flying leap, jaws snapping, teeth tearing, yowling, snaring, and slashed the air with its claws. The wiffle bird shot up into the air and shrieked,
"Get to the point!"
The splinter cat crashed to the ground.
"Get to the point. The point? The point?"
The professor looked up around in desperation.
"Oh, that's where she means. That point up there."
He indicated the sharp needle rock at the top of the hill.
"Run, children. Run for your lives."
He grabbed Lindy's hand and began the steep ascent, scrambling over rocks and stones, and the boys followed. The wiffle bird flew above them and shrieked again,
"Get to the point!"
Dazed and completely confused and frustrated, the splinter cat picked himself up and looked around. And as his vision cleared, he saw the children and the professor. And with a demented howl, he streaked towards them, legs churning, his powerful hind behind, propelling him up the hill in giant leaps and bounds.
"He's gaining on us,"
Tom gasped.
"Don't look back,"
said the professor, and he put on a burst of speed, and Lindy, who still clung to his hand, felt herself momentarily lifted off the ground. They were almost at the top of the hill, but the splinter cat was horribly close. Ben felt the ground shaking and heard that the cat, he was panting behind them with a murderous fury. With a last mighty effort, the creature sprang.
"You got it! You got it! You got it!"
And he roared triumphantly, his huge paws spread wide, the wicked-looking claws flashing like steel knives in the sun. The professor grasped the narrow rock and swung around it, pressing himself and Lindy flat against the rough stone. The boys flung themselves to the ground, and the cat sailed over their heads, a crazed, fearful look on his face. He shrieked, his back legs trying desperately to break his tremendous speed, but it was too late. On the other side of the rock, the hill fell sharply away, and the splinter cat sailed over the edge and landed on the steep incline. His long back legs pushed him forwards and upwards and over, and he rolled and bumped and crashed from side to side, trying desperately to gain a foothold. Great furrows of earth appeared as he dug in his heels. Billowing clouds of dust rose behind him as he plunged, howling at the top of his lungs all the way down. At the bottom of the hill, he tumbled into a field of bright mustard-yellow flowers and completely disappeared. The professor began to chuckle. Relief and exhaustion flooded over him.
"Oh, it's a well-known fact that splinter cats, with their high behinds, are very good at climbing up hills, but they are very bad at going down. Good old Whifflebird. She knew what she was doing when she told us to get to the point.
I can't help but feeling sorry for the splinter cat,
said Lindy. Don't, my dear. And if I'm not mistaken, our furry friend just landed in a field of catnip. He should be ecstatic there for quite some time.
What's ecstatic?
she said. And suddenly, with a squeal of happiness, the splinter cat exploded out of the flowers. He did a double somersault and landed in the blossoms again, and his head popped up with one of the blooms clamping idiotically between his teeth. There was an intoxicated, happy grin on his face, and he began to leap about as if dizzy with delirium. "Oh-wee!" And the children and the professor watched as he yelped and bounced. "Oh, stop, stop! I like it! Oh, it's so wonderful! Sweet, sweet!" And he howled with laughter, as though he were being tickled unmercifully. The children began to giggle as well. "Help, help! Oh, I love it! I love it! I love it!" And they heard the cat mumble passionately, and he went tearing off around the field, tumbling and turning, sniffling and sneezing, twittering and fluttering in an absolute dither of delight. "That, Lindy," said the professor, "is a perfect example of the word ecstatic." We are going to start part 3 now. It is called Conquest. Oh, that's a great word. Here we go. Chapter 1. The professor and the children discovered that the other side of the mountain descended into a series of gently rolling hills. Streams and waterfalls poured forth, splashing and leaping and gurgling down the slopes that joined to the Golden River. The grass was lush and thick, of all sparkling aquamarine blue. Ben noticed that a mass of plum-colored trees in the distance. "What are those?" he pointed. "I'm not really sure. But if my direction is correct, that is the forest of tree squeaks. I would say that right now we are in the heart of Wangdoodle land." The wiffle bird flew around them and landed in the tree, and she fluffed out her beautiful feathers.
"Easy does it!"
she said. The professor looked around. "Let's take the wiffle bird's advice. This seems a good place to rest for a while. There's lots of shade, and I don't think we'll be spotted here."
"You know, I'm hungry. I haven't eaten anything for ages."
"Yeah, I'm starved too," said Tom. The professor reached into the low branches of a strange-looking tree. "Well, that's easy to put right," and he pulled down a soft fruit that resembled a large maroon pineapple. Lindy bit into it.
"Oh, this is fabulous! What kind of tree is that?"
"Oh, that is a fruit of the month tree."
"You mean each month it grows a different kind of fruit?"
"Oh, yes. My first trip to Wangdoodle land, the trees were growing tangerinos. And a few months ago, it was passionanas." The professor plucked one for himself and took a bite. "Ooh, this must be a rizapple. Have some. It'll do you good."
And they ate their fill of the delicious fruit, and then they relaxed in the shade of the tree.
"You know, I've been thinking it might be wise to stay here for the night. It's getting dark, and it will be difficult finding our way back."
The children loved the idea of camping out in Wangdoodle land. The boys rolled up their jackets and used them for pillows. Lindy covered herself with her cape and rested her head on the professor's lap. They watched the pale, translucent moon rise in the emerald green sky, while brilliant stars sparkled overhead. The Wangdoodle's palace gleamed in the night like a huge chandelier. Lindy said wistfully,
"Wow, I wish we were up there looking down instead of the other way around."
"Oh, so do I, Lindy, so do I."
"Professor," said Ben, "how close Have you come to see the Wangdoodle? I mean, before you met us?
Well, I came close enough to know that he was there, Ben. I mean, of course, I talked to the proc a lot, and I met our good friend the Whifflebird, and he looked at her perch in the tree close to Tom, and she appeared to be fast asleep, although it was hard to tell. I never really got much beyond the Gambit region, he continued. I discovered that it wasn't possible for me to reach the Wangdoodle by myself. I needed youthful minds to help me. And that's why I was so thrilled when you came to my door at Halloween, for I had nearly given up hope.
It was kind of like a miracle, wasn't it?
Oh, said Lindy sleepily.
Well, I'd call it more than I'd call it an opportunity. Miracles, contrary to belief, do not just happen. A miracle is an achievement of the impossible, and it is only when we put aside our greed and our anger, pride and prejudices, so that our minds are open and ready to accept it, that a miracle can occur. The Wangdoodle managed to think and do the right things, and look at the miracle he brought about for himself and his friends.
Well, he sure must have tried really hard, said Tom thoughtfully. Do you suppose we ever get to meet him?
If you actually want badly enough, the chances are it will happen. Actually, I've been doing some thinking, and since we've come this far, how would you feel about making one last all-out attempt to reach the Wangdoodle? If we are careful and lucky, we might reach the palace before the proc has any idea we are in the vicinity.
How do you know where the Wangdoodle is? Let us in even if we do reach the palace, said Ben.
Well, I don't, but I have a feeling the closer we are able to get, the more regard he will have for our determination.
Let's do it, said Tom enthusiastically. We haven't gotten much farther, so let's have a go at it. Please, Professor, can we just have one more try?
Yes. Please.
The professor smiled and opened his plastic umbrella with yellow butterflies.
Well, I guess it is settled. Tomorrow we'll make an early start, and just as I said, we need to get some rest.
And he pushed his umbrella handle into the soft earth, and it made a perfect shelter for some gentle night breezes that were blowing across the hills. He stroked Lindy's hair and talked quietly in the darkness about the stars and the constellations. He told them about the furry little creatures called flukes, and how, when the Wangdoodle first left the human world, they had hidden away in a pair of his old slippers. When they were finally discovered, it was too late to send them back. Lulled by his soft voice, the children pulled their scrappy caps down over their eyes and fell into an ease and comfortable sleep. The professor woke them early, and it was barely light, and the sun had yet to show itself. Pockets of mist lay among the vivid blue hills.
"'Tis very imperative that we get through the force of the tree squeaks before they wake up. If they see us, they'll warn the proc, so we have to go and be very quiet."
He led the way down the hill, and the Whifflebird flew onto Tom's shoulder. "Professor," whispered Ben, "there's a road just over there."
"Oh, that's probably the main highway. What a bit of luck!"
The sky was beginning to redden. The professor quickened his pace, and they reached the road and discovered that it was made of shell-pink flowers, clustered so tightly together that it looked like a carpet. A signpost stood on the grassy bank, and one arm pointed to the trees, and it read, "To the forest of the tree squeaks." Another arm below pointed in the same direction, and it read, "To the palace."
"Oh, it's not long now," the professor murmured happily. "Let's take off our shoes. We'll make less noise that way."
The road was cool and springy beneath their feet. Tom noticed some white star-shaped blossoms growing in a hedge with huge berries hanging beneath them. He tugged the professor's sleeve and asked if they could eat some delicious food. The professor picked a berry and tasted it. "Oh, it is delicious."
"Shut your mouth!"
muttered the wiffle bird.
"Why did she say that?"
She's saying we really must be quiet,"
whispered the professor as he handed Tom a fistful of berries.
"Yes, but why does she have to be so rude about it?"
Lindy said as she picked one of the berries and popped it into her mouth. By the time they reached the entrance to the forest, everyone had eaten a scrumptious breakfast. Their first expression of the forest was that it was a dark and gloomy place. But as their eyes adjusted to the light, they saw that it was unusually colorful. The plum-colored trees had brown, gnarled trunks. Most of them were embraced by a vivid pink ivy growing and twining all around the columns and twisted limbs. Garland of honey-creamed flowers hung in the branches, linking one tree to the other. The floor was mossy, embedded with ferns and the color of amethyst. Huge pearl white and crimson orchids grew at the side of the road, which pointed straight as an arrow in the dark interior. Then they saw the eyes. There were thousands of them, large, unblinking, tortoise-shell yellow orbs, staring down through the leaves from every part of the forest. It was such a chilling sight that the professor and the children came to a complete halt. Gradually, they were able to discern the bodies of the tree squeaks, which were hanging upside down by their tails from every tree. They were like little russet-colored monkeys, with wings folded at their sides. Lindy took the professor's hand.
"Are they awake or asleep?"
"Oh, asleep, I think. They have a strange characteristic of being able to sleep with their eyes open. Come on."
They moved forward again, clutching their shoes in their hands. The forest was full of soft rustling sounds and an occasional tiny squeak. The professor and Lindy led the way, with Ben and Tom and the wiffle bird bringing up the rear. Suddenly, Ben startled everyone by giving a clear, loud hiccup. He dropped his shoes and clapped his hands across his mouth. The professor spun around, and Ben's eyes were wide with horror. His shoulders heaved as he hiccuped again. The wiffle bird nervously fluffed out her feathers.
"Shut your mouth!"
"Shh!" hissed the professor. Everyone looked up at the tree squeaks. They had not moved, and the professor picked up Ben's shoes and motioned to the children to follow him. They had only gone a few more paces when Lindy made a high, squeaky sound, like a mouse with a bad attack of the sneezes. She looked panic-stricken and started to apologize, but all of a sudden she had a hiccup and a
"Professor, what shall I do?"
She couldn't stop. The professor hurried and pulled out his big spotted handkerchief. Lindy grabbed it and promptly dropped one of her shoes. Everyone tried to do something at once. Lindy stuffed the handkerchief into her mouth. Ben bent to pick up Lindy's shoes, still keeping one hand across his mouth. The professor caught his umbrella handle in his pocket, and Tom suddenly gave out such a loud that the surprised wiffle bird took off. The professor dived for her and caught her just as she was flying past him. His umbrella and the shoes scattered in all directions.
"Dear wiffle bird," he breathed fervently, "please don't make a sound."
By now, all three children were hiccuping so violently. The professor signaled for everyone to stand still. He stroked the wiffle bird and looked up at the tree squeaks. And despite of the noise, they remained undisturbed.
"I'm going to tie your shoes together so that you can hang them around your neck or shoulder," he whispered. "That way we'll leave your hands free to cover your mouth."
And he gathered up the shoes and gave a pair to each child.
"Now then, when we begin, I want you to follow me, and please try to keep quiet."
At which point he gave the loudest the children had ever heard. The professor looked so startled, it was all that they could do from keeping laughing. The professor lifted up his collar of his jacket and pulled the coat over his head, muffled the sounds that came from his breath beneath, and struggled to stem the attack. The children waited and twitched and shaked, trying desperately to rid themselves of their own fearful spasms of hiccuping. Presently the professor emerged from beneath his coat, his face beet red.
"We should have never eaten those berries. Take a deep breath and hold it as long as you can."
The children did as they were told until they thought their lungs would burst, and then they carefully exhaled, and to their surprise, the hiccups seemed to go away. They all looked around at each other. Everything was silent. Not a sound, not a single peep came from any of them, and they smiled with relief.
"Okay, everybody. Now, here we go. Let's get out of here."
They moved off, and without warning, each of them let forth an explosive, unguarded at exactly the same moment. The noise was so loud that it seemed to split the forest wide open, and the results were disastrous. Every tree squeak rose up into the air, squealing, squawking, screeching, and the entire place rang and throbbed with terrible sounds. Lindy screamed, Tom covered his ears, and the wiffle bird cried, "Mayday! Mayday!" And the professor grumbled,
"Oh, fiddlesticks! Fiddlesticks!"
Ben watched the black cloud of tree squeaks swirling above him. To his amazement, he realized they were screaming, "People! People! People! People!" as loud as they could. The proc and every other creature in the land could not fail to hear such a warning. The wiffle bird's voice cut through the frightful din and said, "Cheer up! Cheer up!" she squawked. "Well, what's that supposed to mean?" shouted Ben. The professor hugged Lindy close because she was sobbing with fright.
"Cheer up! 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 Cheer! That's it! Let's cheer! Let's drown out the noise! I refuse to be intimidated by this racket."
"What's intimidating?"
asked Lindy.
"Oh, never mind, darling. I just want you to sing. I want you to sing as loud as you can. All of you. Remember when we were at our picnic and we sang in the rain and we sang louder and louder? I want you to sing as loud as that."
The professor started to sing a rousing march. The children joined in, stomping and banging their shoes, making so much noise that the wiffle bird got quite excited and flew around shrieking ferociously, "Shoot the works! Shoot the works!" The terrible clamor above them diminished, and their hiccups grew less and less, and the professor, waving his umbrella like a baton, led the way through the forest. Quite suddenly, they emerged from the trees and into the daylight. The morning sun was so bright that it took a moment or two to get used to it. They continued singing until they were all well away from that forest, and the sound of the tree squeaks subsided, and gradually it all faded away. The professor sank onto the grass.
"Oh, my great godfathers," he said. "I have never been through such a frightful experience. My goodness, those miserable tree squeaks and those ghastly hiccups!"
And he clasped his hand to his stomach.
"Was it the berries that made us hiccup?"
said Tom.
"Of course they were. That's what the wiffle bird was saying when she said, 'Shut your mouth.' It meant don't eat."
"Oh, boy, wiffle bird," said Ben. "You know when everything is right, don't you, pretty wiffle bird?"
The wiffle bird made her humming sounds and strutted around very proudly. The professor said,
I really must pay more attention to her. That's the second time I have missed the sense of what she was trying to say, and both times we got in trouble." He prodded Tom. "There's a lesson in that, young man. Learn to listen well when people are talking. First, it is a great art, and second, it's quite possible that when people say one thing, they actually mean another." And he rubbed his forehead wearily and looked at the children. "Oh, you know, we haven't a hope now of reaching the palace without trouble of some kind, and I'm quite sure the Proc heard those tree squeaks, and it is already making plans to stop us. Oh, dear, dear, dear."
"But we are going on, aren't we?" asked Ben, hopefully.
"I'd like to, if that is we all agree. We really are so close."
"I say it's the Proc or us," Tom declared.
"How do you feel about it, Lindy?"
Oh, I feel fine.
she said in a small voice.
I just wish we could stop being surprised all the time.
The professor nodded understandingly and looked around. The region was very different from anything they had seen before. A white desert with cherry red cactus plants growing out of the sandy soil. There were small foothills in the immediate area, and beyond them, the giant mountains and the Wangdoodles palace. The professor got to his feet.
"Well, if we're going to continue, we'd best be on our way."
And he strode off at a good pace, and the children followed behind. Wow, well, that concludes this section of The Last of the Really Great Whangdoodles. Wow, there was a lot that happened there, wasn't it? But they're getting awfully close to the Wangdoodles palace. I wonder, gosh, I hope there's nothing scary going to happen again, but man, I'm so proud of them. And I'm proud of you for sticking with me. So we have 2 more programs coming up, and they again will be just as long, but I am excited to find out what happens. Tune in next time, my friends. Have a great day. Bye-bye.